Thanks, Yasser. That's CGTN's Yasser Hakim reporting from Cairo. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. During his 41-year career in the Foreign Service, Gerald Firestein served as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen. He's currently the senior vice president of the Middle East Institute right here in Washington, D.C. Joining us from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, is Reem Daffa. She's the vice president and executive director of the Saudi American Public Relation Affairs Committee. With us from Boston is Kaveh Afrasiabi. He's an author, political scientist, and Iranian affairs analyst. And Sama'a Al-Hamdani is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute right here in Washington. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Sama'a, let me start with you. The latest information we're getting out of Yemen is that separatists have taken control of the city of Aden. That's a pretty big city, one of the most important cities in the country. How significant is this?
Well, they've been in the city for a while, and they've had control of huge portions of the city before. They've now just managed to push out the forces of President Hadi, which is pretty significant because that means that the Yemeni government doesn't have actual representation in the temporary capital of Aden. So it's alarming in the sense that in the north, you have the Houthis taking over and pushing the government out, and now in the south, you have the separatists doing something that is similar, however different, noting that they were a key component in fighting the Houthis. They were backed and supported by the Arab coalition, and they are the ones who kind of maintained control over large portions of the country. So they're not to be viewed as the Houthis. However, this particular action kind of echoes like it because they've managed to push the government out.
And their goal is to get an independent South. That's what they're saying. Long
term. However, short term, what they're actually saying is that they want to share power with the Yemeni government. And so what they're asking for is more representation and ability to have separatist rulers dictate and kind of have authority over the city of Aden. So they're just guaranteeing that in the future, in a few years, they can have that self-determination.
All right, sorry, I just need some clarification on this. This group is backed by the United Arab Emirates.
Yes, and the Arab coalition collectively. So it's backed by KSA and the UAE. However, the UAE...
But they're fighting the Saudi-backed government. That's where it gets confusing.
So yes, I think in a very strange way, I think a lot of people are confused. But what we see is that in the past 4 days, the Yemeni dynamic and reality kind of took its own development, and the Arab coalition kind of stood back. We didn't hear a statement come out of Saudi Arabia for four days. And in that process, I think there was a sort of test to see the realities of the ground, who's actually more powerful. And I think what we're seeing now is MBZ of the UAE meeting with King Salman in Saudi Arabia. And I think what they're going to agree on is that the Yemeni government goes back to Aden and continues its operations, but to allow more STC, which is the Southern Transitional Council, the separatist movement, more representation in the Yemeni government.
Lots of groups there, Ambassador. What do you make of this latest turn of events? The city of Aden, of course, is the seat of the government, or the base for the government, although the president himself, Abdul Rabi Mansour Hadi, is in Riyadh. But taking over the city, is that big?
Well, it is significant. As Sama'a said, the issue is who actually is going to be in control of Aden. And it goes beyond that because it also reflects divisions within the coalition between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, particularly in terms of the support that Saudi Arabia has provided to the Hadi government and elements of the Hadi government that are seen by the United Arab Emirates as being pro-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-political Islam. That's a bigger issue for the Emirates than it is for Saudi Arabia. These differences between Saudi Arabia and the UAE have played out in Aden over the last several years. As you said, and as Sama'a said, the Emiratis have been more supportive of the Southern Transition Council. They've provided the weapons and military training for elements for the STC, whereas the Saudis have been more supportive of the Hadi government and have invested more heavily in supporting elements that are more closely aligned with Hadi.
Reem, how is this being viewed by the Saudi Arabians?
It's actually being invited. They're inviting, you have to realize that what separates, well, not intended, the separatist group, STC, from, let's say, the Houthis or any other group in Yemen is that they are willing to negotiate. They are willing to come to the negotiation table, unlike the Houthis that have failed multiple times to come to the negotiation table and be part of the forward-thinking process to alleviate what's happening in the region and in Yemen. So what's going on right now is King Salman has invited MBZ, President Hadi, and the SDC to come, and they've agreed and accepted the invitation to come and to talk about a resolution and steps to move forward for what is best for the Yemeni people.
Kaveh Afrasiabi, as we can hear, this is a very complex situation there in Yemen. In fact, President Hadi has called the seizure of Aden a coup. How do you view this, and what impact will it have on any kind of negotiations to resolve this war there?
Well, President Hadi has been a nominal figurehead for quite some time, and this so-called coup against him in Aden illustrates the serious political crisis that both he and his supporters in Riyadh and the Emirates are facing. The fact that the separatists now are the dominant power in Aden and the surrounding areas, and they will run the show regardless of this surface show meeting in Riyadh in the coming days. So the political reality on the ground has changed. The Saudis are themselves to blame for this, because while they have nominally supported the restoration of the so-called legitimate government, which is very questionable in the first place, they and the UAE have armed, given money, and trained the separatists who are calling for a very separate South Yemen government, and they have set into motion a process that will be very difficult to reverse now. And so, we're dealing with a new reality, and the UN lags behind and has to start communicating with the power brokers in Aden instead of just the Hadi people who are out of office now. So we're dealing with a much more complex reality in Yemen that calls for recalibrating the strategies for peace. And hopefully, the parties involved, the stakeholders, both at the local, regional, and international level, will reckon with the new reality and will adjust their approaches so that there can be a meaningful peace process there.
Ambassador?
I just wanted to make a couple of points. One, of course, the friction between the Southern Transition Council and the Hadi government isn't new. We've actually had in the past, in January of 2018, for example, we've had very similar kinds of explosions between the two sides, street fighting inside of Aden, which was eventually resolved by the coalition partners, by the Saudis and the Emiratis intervening and basically getting the two sides to separate and go back into their respective corners. The other reality is that I was part of a delegation that visited Aden about a month ago, and the reality was that most of the city of Aden was already under the control of the Southern Transition Council. So what you've seen over these last few days is actually, as Sama'a said, it's actually the Southern Transition Council moving against some elements of the Hadi government that were still in the city, but the reality was that the security, that the political presence, that the dominant forces in Aden were already and have been already under the control of the Southern Transition Council.
Sama'a, when Kaveh Afrasiabi talks about new realities and recalibrating strategies for peace, does that mean that there'll be some kind of devolved power in the different regions of Yemen, perhaps autonomy for more autonomy for certain regions?
I think that there needs to be an adjustment of some sort into the way that Yemen is approached. Specifically, the war, it's been ongoing for 5 years. In a sense, it's really risky what's happening now. If the Arab coalition is able to kind of strike a deal between the Southern Transitional Council and the Yemeni government, then there's a potential that that could be the start of actually having a functioning government in Yemen. I think the problem with what's happening in Yemen is that this entire war is waged to restore Yemen's president to power and to restore his government, and that is really important. I mean, Yemen cannot lose, whatever structure they had of government. The problem is that the president and his government have failed to communicate with the people, have failed to address their concerns, have failed to act as if they are taking care of the Yemeni people. And by that, you can see that in the past few days, there were armed clashes in Aden, and President Hadi failed to issue any statement. As a matter of fact, members of his government issued statements that were really harsh and almost felt like they were representative of a specific group of the Yemeni government as opposed to the government as a whole. And so whether it's in the north or in the south, it's really problematic when you're trying to restore a Yemeni government. However, that government or that president per se is not able to kind of do his part, right, to go back to power and to restore order. And it's really problematic because President Hadi, for the sake of the conflict that's taken place, cannot be replaced. We have United Nations Security Councils that are making sure that he has to go back to power.
Right.
So this could be an opportunity to kind of find a way to adjust some things and to allow for a new government to come to power, still represented by President Hadi, to kind of save Yemen from complete rupture.
Can I address that, please?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I really think, these false assumptions around President Hadi, the mask has fallen. We all know that he has absolutely no backing inside Yemen, north or south. And, this coup against him, is, the last straw. And I really don't think that we can turn the clock back. And all these talks of restoring Hadi to power, this is self-delusional. And we need to, reckon with the actual reality. Instead of deluding ourselves, the Saudis have to stop this rhetoric of the legitimate government that doesn't wash with anyone, including their own allies that they've now started bombarding. So this false narrative, the time has come to discard it.
Is it a false narrative, Sama'a? Is it delusional to think of restoring President Hadi to power?
I think President Hadi needs to step into action, and it's not represented in President Hadi himself, but rather his government. So it's a trickle-down effect.
Yeah.
It seems that the few governments he's appointed have failed to operate.
All right.
And the current government that we have now in Yemen is actually far better than the first governments he created when the war first started. So there is some progress of some sort. However, it's almost like it's being done in lost time. And so I think to some degree, appointing people in the government that are actually powerful on the ground would actually help restore some of that legitimacy to the government. And I think, the fact that the president is in Riyadh is not helping. He had a chance for 4 years or 5 years actually, to go back to Yemen and operate from Aden, and he decided not to do that, which, without a public explanation, does come across as someone who's not concerned to what's happening to the Yemeni people.
All right, I want to go back to Reem in Jeddah. And Reem, there's been, of course, a lot of reporting on what's been going on in Yemen, but some analysts say the seizure of Aden has exposed divisions within the Sunni Muslim coalition, which is led by Saudi Arabia. There was one paper which was put out by a scholar at Oxford University, Elizabeth Kendall, in which she said it's becoming increasingly obvious that the UAE and Saudi Arabia do not share the same end goals in Yemen, even though they share the same goal of pushing back the perceived influence of Iran. What do you make of that?
I make of that is incorrect in interpretation. The coalition, it's been solid since 2015 with the leadership of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the solid following of UAE and other countries, but the actual fraction, there is no fraction, and if there's any fraction, it's happening on the ground in Aden. Unfortunately, it's like the movie Inception, it's a civil war within a civil war. But going back to the coalition, it's a strategic movement that's going on, and it's a movement of power and military tactics on the ground. You need to realize that the coalition is not just the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It started off with 9 countries, and their responsibilities and movement on the ground and political position changes over time and within these 5 years. But the end goal is still the same, is to protect the region from the Houthis, the Iranian-backed Houthis, ISIS, and to cover up for, not cause an extra vacuum that allows for terrorists and Al-Qaeda to move in and cause more destruction on the ground in Yemen.
Okay.
Is that not a current goal? Yes, it is a mutual goal and a very strong goal for people to unite within the coalition and to talk with the Yemeni people.
Sama'a, very quickly, your response to that?
Yes, so I do think that the Arab coalition is united in its war, but they're also separated in their interests, as so very clearly as we see right now. And I don't think that's actually an expression of different UAE-Saudi interests. That's actually an expression of Yemeni interests going separate ways. But it's very clear that the UAE has particular interests that naturally would differ from those of Saudi Arabia. And we've seen it in the approach, in how they approach the war. The UAE was willing to send in troops into Yemen very early on into the war. They were very hands-on. And then they also supported different groups outside of the Yemeni government.
Right.
They started supporting militias, and then Saudi Arabia started doing the same by default because they saw that that kind of worked for the UAE, and they started doing something similar to it. And more recently, we saw the UAE pull out all its troops. So it was a unilateral kind of pull out while they continue to have interest in Yemen. However, it seems that they are partners in this war, but they have different approaches, different strategies, different objectives. Ultimately, the overall goal, I think that Reem was accurate about that. But I think that there are other smaller goals that are not made public that they're working on as well.
Right. Ambassador, how is the United States viewing this? At one time, I mean, the view we had of this war there is that on the one side, we had the Saudi-backed forces, which wants to restore the government of Yemen. On the other side, we had Iranian-backed forces, the Houthis. But now it's a lot more complex than that, isn't it?
Well, it is complicated, but I don't think that it's actually meant that there's a change in the U.S. approach or the support that the United States has provided to the legitimate government, to the Saudi-led coalition. And the fact of the matter is that the entire UN Security Council continues to support the principle of the return of the legitimate government. Whether there are differences between the Saudis and the Emiratis, differences between the legitimate government and the Southern Transition Council, the reality is that all of these parties oppose the idea that the Houthis are going to seize power by force, which is what triggered this conflict in September of 2014. And so there's no difference about that, and the United States continues to support that principle, that the political transition that was launched in 2011 by all of the political parties inside of Yemen, that continued, that tried to address many of these fundamental issues through a national dialogue conference in 2013-14, that we need to go back to that. We need to complete that process. We need to get to a political transition that allows Yemenis to speak for themselves about what kind of government they want, what kind of a future they want for Yemen. And until we end this conflict, we're not going to get to that. And that is the U.S. position.
Kaveh Afrasiabi, what do you make of the international efforts to end this war, to resolve the situation in Yemen? We did have in fact, the UN Special Envoy, he has said that this is an issue that, in his words, is eminently resolvable. Whatever happened to the Stockholm Pact, which was agreed to last December? That's about 7 months ago.
Well, despite some ceasefire violations, both sides seem to be, holding on to the Stockholm Agreement, and a lot of works in the pipeline with respect to, for example, the situation in Thais. There is a joint committee that's supposed to be formed and resolve the issue there, as well as, the centerpiece of Stockholm is, of course, the port city of Hodeida, as well as the other nearby ports of Salif and Ras Isa. And the situation there now is rather murky because just the other day, I read that the Sudanese forces refused to vacate despite the fact that the UN has certified the withdrawal of the Houthi forces. So the UN has to have a more muscular presence in Hodeidah, in my opinion. It needs to have a more proactive approach with a more inclusive strategy that talks with all the stakeholders in this conflict. And I commend Mr. Griffith, the UN envoy, for all his shuttle diplomacy and so forth. But the UN is part of the solution as well as the problem, because the parameters of the UN Security Resolution 2216 is very problematic. It calls for the unilateral disarmament of the Houthis and turning over the capital of Sana'a to this very illegitimate government of Hadi. And everyone knows, anyone who is mildly familiar with the situation there knows that that's very unrealistic and unobtainable objective.
Sama'a, we have not talked about the humanitarian situation so far in Yemen. What is the situation? Has it improved since in the last few months? Because the last time we talked about this, there were more than 22 million Yemenis in need of aid,
Yes.
more than 4 million who are displaced.
Mm-hmm. So the statistics remain very similar, and actually a lot more than that could potentially, a lot more than 22 million of the Yemeni population could be at risk of immediate famine had it not been for the assistance of humanitarian agencies and the delivery of food aid to these families, meaning that if that aid stops, these families could potentially starve to death. It's really alarming, but the way to look at the humanitarian crisis at this point is that there is an economic warfare on top of the political warfare that we're seeing, and that warfare is designed to kind of weaken the Houthi handle on the war. However, in effect, what it's done is that the Houthis have pressure on them, therefore they're pressuring the population underneath them to pay the price for it. And so it's like a trickle-down effect of an economic warfare where those who are being hurt are already those who are hungriest, weakest, poorest, already displaced, especially those who are displaced by little battles. They leave their homes, they come back, and that home is already looted or gone or destroyed. And then they become a really weak and fragile part of the community. With 5 years in, we still don't have a system in place to assist those people in a very efficient way. Every time a battle occurs, we have to frazzle and kind of figure out a way to deal with with this particular population, as opposed to already having a system in place that is going to predict this kind of behavior.
Okay, Reem, talking about the humanitarian situation in Yemen, the United Nations has criticized Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for paying only a modest part of the $750 million that they promised in humanitarian. That's $750 million each that they promised for humanitarian aid in Yemen. Is that going to increase? What is the Saudi view on this?
The Saudi view on this is just like any view of any country. I mean, the management of that money going into Yemen is not being carried out as planned. It's being blocked by the Houthis. It's being stolen by Houthi rebels and Iranian-backed Houthis. It's not reaching the end people or the end clients, who are the poor people who are unfortunately being hurt by famine and are extremely poor and have many diseases. You cannot fund something that is not reaching its end person or end client, unfortunately. So there's bad management when it comes to UN, when it comes to management of these funds. So going forward, the system is unfortunately clogged in two areas. One is the UN and the management of these funds. Two is the blocking and the stealing from the Houthi side for these aid efforts to reach the Yemeni people.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.